Okay. All right, and I just wanted to welcome everyone today. My name is Kimberly Wong, and I'm actually the chair of Democrats Abroad China. Okay, and for today, our agenda is like this. In the first 10 minutes, we'll be doing a little bit of an introduction of ourselves as well as the speaker, Mr. Quentin Palfrey, and he has a talk that he's prepared for us, and we'll also have a Q&A. At the very end, we're going to take a photo together, and we're also going to have a couple of call to actions, upcoming volunteer opportunities and events. Please, for everyone that has questions, please look for the users with exclamation point mod to submit questions during the talk, and then we'll try and get as many answered as possible. And also, it would be great if maybe everyone also refrains from using the chat at the time, because at the end, we're actually going to be posting a lot of resources and links in there, which we'll also send out an email. Okay, so Democrats Abroad China, who are we? We are the country committee serving United States Democrats living in China. And what do? We help Americans abroad participate in U.S. domestic politics by providing voter registration support, voting resources, activism opportunities, conversations with leading activists and elected officials, and opportunities to socialize with like-minded expats. And it's been really amazing, actually, even to see that, you know, how many participants we have from all over the world today. So thank you for coming. And this is how you can connect with DA members inside China. We have a couple of different city groups that cover all the major areas so far. And we also have our own caucuses. So if you have just special interest, we have a lot of events and speakers that also come out of that too. These are just some of the examples of some of the events that we have put on. We are a group of really dedicated volunteers and always looking for more. And so what is the biggest initiative about Democrats Abroad, and also why we're all here on this call today, is our nonpartisan platform, votefromabroad.org, because we want everyone to be able to vote in elections. And so again, that's a nonpartisan tool that we use. And just to remind everyone why voting matters, especially from those living abroad, just one example of why your vote counts is that sometimes elections can be won by extremely small margins, and many times it can be us that actually make this happen. And of course, we definitely need help because we are a volunteer-run organization. If you want to support Democrats Abroad China and RMB, there's a QR code right there. It can help us offset costs, for example, a printer or ink for when we're helping register anyone to vote, US citizens to vote. If you want to donate through ActBlue for initiatives such as phone banking, which means calling people to remind them to vote, it would be at that link below. And don't worry, you don't need to screenshot or take notes of things. We'll have everything for you at the end. And now I would love to pass it over to our General Counsel, Alexander Lee, to introduce our speaker today. So take it away.
Great, thanks, Kim. Everybody can hear me? You can just nod. Great. So I've known Quentin and a couple of other folks on this call a long time, and I'm really glad to welcome him to China for this first in our speaker series, or second in our speaker series, sorry. Excited to introduce somebody who's really dedicated his life to public service. He is the head of the Voter Protection Corps, and that's a nonprofit organization that works on overcoming obstacles that voters face to registering and voting and having their votes count. And that's kind of what we're facing in the election ahead in so many ways, both abroad and in back at home. And so he's going to talk about the issues at home and the issues that face us as expats. And during the 2008 presidential campaign, Quentin served as the voter protection director for that president that we're all pining for, Barack Obama. And he did that in Ohio. So he's got a lot of experience at the organizing level, but he also has a lot of experience at the policy level. And he was the Deputy General Counsel for Strategic Initiatives at the U.S. Department of Commerce, I believe under Secretary Locke, and a Chinese American. And as the first chief of the healthcare division in the office of the Massachusetts Attorney General, he did a lot of really, really great work there as well. So he's got a broad background, and of course, he ran for lieutenant governor last time in Massachusetts. And so I won't say much more because I want to give him plenty of time to speak and for all of us to ask questions. But I'm so pleased that we can have him here this evening. Quentin.
Thank you so much, Alexander, and thank you, Kim and Elaine, and thanks all of you for joining here today. I'm also a proud former Democrat abroad, so I spent a little bit of time running a nonprofit organization in the Philippines and have some experience with the joys of living abroad and being an American trying to participate in our process. As Alexander mentioned, I've been involved in voter protection issues for a number of years. This is the 5th presidential election where I've worked on voter protection issues. And like many people, I first got interested in the issue of voting rights in the wake of the 2000 elections. So, we all watched as ballot design errors and voter confusion and poor judicial decision-making changed the course of history in the Bush v. Gore election. If you think about sort of where we would be right now with the global climate crisis and with issues in the Middle East and in China, if Al Gore rather than George W. Bush had been elected president, you know how important some of these voting rights issues can be. In the 2004 election, I was hired to be the voter protection director for the Kerry Edwards campaign in New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire at the time, they were coming off of an election in 2002 where voter suppression had been the subject of a criminal conspiracy. So the Republican Party had engaged in an organized scheme to jam the phone lines in the Get Out the Vote effort of the Democrats and a related union. They had also sent voter challengers to college campuses, in particular the voting place around Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, to systematically challenge every voter who looked like they were under about 25. And the goal was not to actually question those individual voters, but to cause the kind of chaos and delay that leads to lines and that discourages people from voting. And in 2004, we sort of spent a lot of that energy trying to communicate to students what their rights were in New Hampshire. And we were successful, the only state that was successful in moving from red to blue. We were sitting in the headquarters of the campaign in Manchester, and we were starting to celebrate, but our hearts sank because we saw on the screens footage from CNN of Ohio. And what we saw were these 4- and 5-hour lines in African-American communities where people would wait to vote. Many of them didn't have a chance to vote at all. And whether or not that caused the difference between John Kerry and George Bush winning that election, it's an assault on the underpinnings of our democracy that we have this two-tiered system. In the United States, if you're African-American, if you're young, if you're homeless, if you're a Native American, you often face obstacles to registering and voting that just aren't faced by other folks in the system. And those kinds of disparities persist to this day. In 2004, as Alexander mentioned, I was given the opportunity to go to Ohio and to run President Obama's voter protection effort there. And we were focused directly on those lines. these lines that particularly affect African Americans. We put 4,000 lawyers into the field in Ohio alone. We went to the US Supreme Court and to the Ohio Supreme Court. And I was really proud to be part of the team that helped elect President Obama. I was also proud of the opportunity that Alexander mentioned, which was to go and work in that administration under President Obama and Vice President Biden, and felt like we were part of a generation of people who were fighting for important issues. We were trying to claw our way out of the worst recession at the time since the Great Depression. Unfortunately, we have another one in front of us. But we also felt like we were able to kind of move forward on some important issues. And in 2016, like many of you, I worked really hard to try to elect a president who would carry on that legacy and those values. And I have to admit that I've been devastated by what's come since. There's a cruelty to this administration that rips apart families and puts walls between us and our neighbors, tries to knock tens of millions of people off of health insurance. But there's also an attack on the fundamental underpinnings of our democracy. They don't believe in truth. They don't believe in science. They attack the Constitution. And I think we've struggled with how to deal with these attacks on our American values. And now we sit at the cusp, about 4.5 months away from the most important election of our lifetime. And we do that at a time when we have a president who has made it clear that he will weaponize lies about voter fraud in order to raise obstacles to people registering, voting, and having their votes count. And we've seen a series of primaries over the last couple of months in which the kinds of problems that voters have experienced for many years have been much, much worse. So on Tuesday in Georgia, there were horrendous obstacles to voters, many long lines, many people who were disenfranchised. We saw the same thing in Nevada. We saw the same thing in Washington, D.C. We saw the same thing in Philadelphia. Last month in Wisconsin was one of the worst run elections we've seen in a long time. We also do this in an environment where a number of the tools that we've used to fight against voter suppression have been taken away through the courts. So a few years ago, the US Supreme Court reversed a key portion or shot down a key portion of the Voting Rights Act, which has made it harder for states or for the federal government to restrain bad behavior within states with deep legacies of voter suppression. We have also seen recently in a sort of a little noticed case, the US Supreme Court, the US Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, which is the set of federal courts that oversee Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey, recently lifted an injunction that the Republican National Committee had been under. So a couple of decades ago, the RNC was held responsible for voter suppression activities of the kind that I was talking about happening in New Hampshire, where there were sort of systematic efforts to challenge voters and to make it difficult for voters to vote. And for many years, the Republicans would have been in contempt of court if they engaged in those, what they call sort of voter integrity efforts. The US Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit recently lifted that injunction. And as a result, the Republicans are free to engage in some behavior that they haven't been able to engage in the recent past. And the RNC has committed $50 million to activities that fall under this mantle for this year. So unfortunately, we face, I think, 3 challenges that are more stark than they have been in the past. One are a series of systemic disparities between the resources that are available in communities of color and in communities of students and what's faced by other voters. Number 2 is president and allies who are shameless in their willingness to use voter suppression as a tool for making it harder for people to vote. And then the third, as everyone knows, is a global pandemic. And the global pandemic has had a meaningful impact on the way that people vote, certainly during the primaries, and as we expect to continue to be the case through November. And that has caused a lot of local election officials to have to change the way that they think about offering resources for voters on the fly. And one of the difficulties with changing voting systems quickly is that often that leads to more confusion and more errors. So in Iowa, as many of you saw, the Democratic Party through the caucus system tried to change the way that people voted in the caucus to voting through a series of apps. And the rollout of that new effort was marred with flaws. We'll think about trying to change 50 states' election systems over the course of a couple of months and then communicate that with voters, as well as changing the way that, we vote globally. So there are very significant challenges. The good news is that there are a series of efforts that have been underway for quite some time to try to identify some of the challenges that voters are going to face and try to solve them well ahead of time. So as many of you know, the former Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia, whose name is Stacey Abrams, is a very prominent voting rights activist and has launched an initiative called Fair Fight, which has been very successful in raising money and filtering it through state parties to allow for many of the battleground states to have more resources devoted to voter protection than they ever have before. Now, the Biden campaign as the nominee for president is starting to emerge. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about an effort that I run, which I would love to get all of you involved in, which is called the Voter Protection Corps. And I think Kim has some slides that I could use just to give you a brief overview of what we're doing and how you could help. But the Voter Protection Corps is a national network of voter protection experts and some data scientists. So as I mentioned, I've been involved in running state voter protection efforts and advising the Democratic National Committee on some of their voter protection efforts for a couple of decades. And one of the things that we've learned is that a lot of the challenges that voters face on election day aren't solvable on election day. A lot of the things that cause these problems happen earlier than that. And unfortunately, we tend to have more volunteers and more energy and more resources in the days and weeks before election day. So there's a little bit of a mismatch between when people focus on these issues and when they are actually solvable. The other thing that we've found is that people tend to be anecdotal in the way that they think about and solve these problems. And it turns out that data is quite useful for helping us to identify some of the places where the problems are most likely to occur and target resources to them. So we need to be more data informed about our interventions. And so what the Voter Protection Corps has done, and what we're in the process of doing, is really focusing on the kinds of problems that can be solved well in advance of the election, and trying to devote resources to overcoming those challenges. So in some cases, these problems arise at the county level. A lot of election administration in the United States is run not through the federal government, but through the states, and in many cases, not even through the state level government, but also at the county level or the municipal level. Yeah.
Sorry, don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to let you know that I have the Our Projects slide up right now. So just let me know when you
Terrific.
need to flip to the next slide, okay?
Wonderful, Kim. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And so one of the things that we have been doing is trying to work with county officials and state level officials to try to identify certain kinds of shortcomings. So as we've talked about how to reform our elections in the wake of the coronavirus. One of the key features of this has been a move towards vote by mail and an increase in the utilization of absentee voting measures. So this is, of course, familiar to all of you who vote from abroad, but in the United States, historically, most voters have voted in person. There's been a national movement to increase the utilization of vote by mail techniques, and I think that this is entirely right. The president has recently spread lies that try to highlight supposed flaws in vote by mail as a system. But pretty much anybody who has looked at this seriously has seen that this is a system that has worked quite well. And even Twitter, which is very reluctant to fact check the president, took the very unusual step of fact checking him on his lies about vote by mail. And this is a method that has now been used in a number of states and has been successful with both red states and blue states. So even in Utah, which historically votes Republicans and still votes in large numbers for Republicans, vote by mail has been very successful. One of the places we've seen a little bit less attention than I think is deserved is on in-person voting resources. So it turns out that in the United States, the groups that are most likely to use vote by mail are more affluent communities and communities that have more resources, where addresses are a little bit more stable. And some of the communities that are least likely to utilize vote by mail are communities of color, younger people, homeless people, and Native Americans. And in my view, there's been a disproportionate focus on the kinds of challenges that can be overcome through vote by mail, but there still are a large number of challenges that we need to focus on with in-person voting. And you see that manifested, for instance, in Georgia on Tuesday, where 5 hours after the polls closed, there were still voters trying to vote. We saw similar kind of problems in Nevada on Tuesday as well. And that gets down to some pretty specific problems. So one of them is poll workers. And, you know, it sounds like kind of a mundane challenge, but we're going to need almost 1 million human beings to staff polls. Well, historically, more than 50% of those folks have been over the age of 60. Folks over the age of 60 during the global coronavirus pandemic are some of the least likely to want to sit in a polling place and interact with voters for a long period of time. Even with good social distancing measures, you can understand why that population might be reluctant to play that role. But if you don't have enough poll workers, what you end up having is much, much longer lines. And the social science is very clear that if you have long lines, what ends up happening is that people don't vote. Some people are willing to stick it out, but it is one of the most effective voter suppression measures there is to have long lines in communities where people vote a certain way and short lines in communities where people vote a different way. And so thinking about poll workers and how we make sure that there are enough of them ends up being one of the most important things that we can do over the next few months. Another problem that we're running into is polling place closures. So it turns out that a lot of the places where people vote in the United States are in senior centers and other kinds of public facilities where social distancing is difficult or where it's going to be challenging to clean the facility before and after voting. But when there is pressure to close polling places, this feels easier. You then need fewer poll workers. It costs the municipalities less money. But that has an extraordinary impact on the availability of voting. So in Milwaukee, which is a large city in Wisconsin, where they had a very, very unsuccessful primary election last month, they had gone from 180 polling locations to 5. Well, if you reduce the number of polling locations, there are two things that happens. One is there often are fewer resources at one than there are at the larger number. But they're also farther from voters. So in Georgia in 2018, in the election where Stacey Abrams was narrowly defeated in a very unfair election, one of the strategies that the Secretary of State, who was running for government, employed to make it harder for people to vote was to close the polling places near the African American communities, leave open the polling places that were near the white populations, and then people who had transportation challenges were not able to get from where they had historically voted to where they needed to vote. So we need to make sure that there are enough polling places that are left open so that people will be able to vote. So I think what I'll do is just mention some of the ways that that I think we can work together, and then I'd love to sort of take some questions and talk about what's on your mind. But I want to say sort of 3 things that folks should think about doing. The first is to think about your involvement in organizations like Democrats Abroad and in other organizations that are focused on preserving our democracy, not as something you do at the very end, but as something that you do from now until the end. I'd like to encourage you to get involved in Democrats Abroad. I'd like to encourage you to think about organizations like the Voter Protection Corps that are doing work now, because a lot of the things with the highest leverage, the highest impact, are the things that you can do in the next 4.5 months. And now is the time to do the work that it's going to take to make sure that this election turns out the way that we all hope it will. The next thing is, it is important to vote and to be involved around Election Day. So you are ambassadors for the Democrats Abroad community. And as we get closer to Election Day, you should think about whether there's some time you can take off, whether there's some specific tasks that you can be involved in that will help get out the vote. Getting out the vote, of course, in the expatriate community is a different kind of a challenge than it is standing on a street corner or a polling place in Ohio, but think about ways that you can be actively involved in helping other people request their absentee ballots, helping them get them in, helping them navigate some of the complicated questions around absentee voting, and be involved in the election itself. And then finally, there are a lot of structural changes that I think that we should be focusing on over the longer term to make it easier for folks to vote. We have a shamefully racially discriminatory legal election system. And it is unfortunate that one of the parties has decided that their key to victory during a time when they no longer have a majority of the actual voters is to make it harder for folks to vote. Some of that is voter suppression, some of that is gerrymandering, some of that is campaign finance laws that are fundamentally skewed towards wealthier people and corporations. But there are a lot of systemic challenges to our democracy that we are not going to fix between now and November, and that will not magically go away if Donald Trump is defeated and Joe Biden is elected. And so this is a long-term challenge for all of us, and I would encourage you to get involved in that challenge over time and help support or lead organizations that are taking on a piece of that challenge. I think with that, I'd love to move on to answering any questions that have come up.
Okay, I'm gonna just stop the screen share so we can. All right, first up, I apologize for probably not pronouncing your name correctly. Onelika, DA Belgium, you're on.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yeah, great. Thank you, Quentin. That's really good to, learn more about voter suppression. And I'm just wondering what could we do for Democrats abroad? And, do you have any advice for the kind of stuff we can do to, we already see many of our members having obstacles getting even their ballot. So I'm thinking on the lines of, should we perhaps deploy some volunteers to help these members, calling the election offices back home and support the navigating, the not so straight system to get their ballot? And also I'm thinking, should we put funds aside to then help people pay for FedEx or DHL so the ballots arrive on time? I just want to pick your brains of what kind of things we could do as Democrats abroad.
So I'd love to let Kim or Alexander or Elaine answer part of that question. Let me make two suggestions though. One of them is that I think communication is key. So I was very pleased to see one of the slides that Democrats abroad in China is engaged in an affirmative outreach effort to try to inform people about the ways that they can request and submit their absentee ballots. And I think it's really important that we think about this at scale and think about how we make sure that we get positive and informative messaging out, probably mostly on social media and through the internet. So I think those are important efforts, and certainly supporting Democrats abroad financially to help with that outreach effort, I think is really important. And then, of course, it's also about answering specific questions that specific voters have and trying to sort of troubleshoot some of those challenges. So I think that there's sort of a mass communication effort, and then there's sort of an individual kind of troubleshooting effort. And I think if you have the resources to do both of those things, that probably is a good way to go. But I don't know whether Kim or Alexander or Elaine, whether you have any thoughts.
We did get some information this morning that the and you might know more about this than I do, but that the consulates and the embassies, really the American services at the consulates, will be prioritizing or allowing people to drop off their ballots within the next few days. They'll be sort of reopening, so things should be a little easier because it'll be in phase 1 rather than phase 2. So that's a good thing. But I think in terms of DA, we're going to be encouraging folks in each of the country committees to reach out to their local consulate and make sure that they're following the protocol.
I just also wanted to follow up a little bit on what Alexander just said, is that make sure that you all are getting in touch with your consulate in each of your countries just to double check everything. It's always better to have the actual personal connection set up now. And you see that Evelyn did say some countries do not send out the ballots to overseas voters. Just to let you all know that your overseas ballot actually gets sent to you 45 days before the election. So what we're doing right now is only sending in our ballot request. Okay, can we, let's see, next question. Sorry, got a little bit lost in the chat. All right, Helen, you are on.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Helen.
Hi. So my question is related to, you talked about how voter center reduction has resulted in voter suppression for a lot of minority populations. And I was wondering, are there any actions currently taken that are making it more difficult for voters who need multilingual services to vote, specifically? Because historically, certain populations have needed either multilingual translation services or ballot services that need to be in other languages.
Yeah, this is a terrific question. And the answer is yes. I think that a lot of the decision making around those services happens at the local level. And where you have sort of better local election administration in a geographic area, they do a better job of matching the language services that they have available to the population in their community. And it is certainly a way in which a lot of local election officials sort of fall short. One of the things that I'm most worried about in that respect is budget crunches being an excuse for reducing those services at the local level. So, you know, it is true that in the pandemic, the state and local budgets are getting crushed. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. There's a very significant shortfall in terms of state and local tax revenue. And there are very difficult choices that are being made by some of these state and local decision makers. But at the same time, there are a lot of resources that have come to local governments through the CARES Act, which is the federal coronavirus recovery money. And there was some pre-existing money through the Help America Vote Act, which is called HAVA. So one of the things that I think that we need to do is put pressure on states and on counties to allocate those resources to the kinds of things that make it easier for populations that have historically faced obstacles to be able to vote. One of those, of course, is language assistance. Another of them is disabled access. I think that access for folks with physical disabilities, as well as you know, language and hearing and visual disabilities, is that's going to be one of the areas that's going to take a severe hit, both because of resources and also as they change the way that certain polling places are laid out. Right. So if you close places that have been set up to be accessible, and you have to scramble to find new places, or if you're closing down a lot of places, you're going to have other kinds of obstacles. So I think it's a really important issue, and I think it's an area where we're not going to see where we're going to see some challenges.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question is from Evelyn. Evelyn, you're on. Are you still muted? What's going on? Technical issues? Evelyn? Evelyn?
So I can see from inside the chat that Evelyn had a question about counties failing to send absentee ballots to people. So I can take a crack at that. I have a bad answer, which is that this is a huge problem, and it's going to be a problem for you as a community of people who are going to vote this way. There have been some counties and some states who have used sort of slow response to absentee ballot requests as an intentional voter suppression strategy. So there was a very good documentary, if anyone has a moment, it's a 25-minute documentary called Suppressed, which was created about the 2018 election in Georgia. It's a very well done documentary if anybody wants to take a look. And it shows some of the ways that this had an impact on the 2018 Georgia election, where slow walking voter requests for absentees in Georgia was a way of making it harder for those folks to vote. And we've certainly seen that through the primaries, whether through intentional actions or because these systems are overwhelmed. There's been a delay in absentee processing. There's been a delay in new registration processing. I was talking to a man yesterday who's one of the nation's election law experts, and he was saying he thinks that we have a ventilator level resource problem with absentee ballot processing machines. So if you think about in the coronavirus context, one of the things that we've all been worried about is when things spike, if there aren't enough ventilators, people die. One of the things that he was identifying as potentially a challenge that we have coming is that if you have a massive increase in absentee ballot requests and you have a massive increase in vote by mail, but you don't have a proportionate increase in the resources for processing that, we're going to have some huge resource challenges, and that's going to disenfranchise voters, and it's going to disenfranchise the kinds of voters that typically have the most trouble voting, and it may create problems for you all. So I would say, you know, in terms of the practical aspects of this, one is apply early and follow up frequently. From a sort of policy level, we have been pushing very hard for ballots that have been postmarked by Election Day as opposed to ballots that are received by Election Day to be considered timely as states go through. Many of the states are pushing through legislative packages to change the rules for elections this year for obvious reasons. On each of those conversations, we're saying, look, if ballots are postmarked by Election Day, they should count. So I think that's absolutely the right thing. And, you know, I think that it will mitigate to some extent the problem that we're running into in that sense. It is going to create another problem, though. And here, this is something that keeps me up at night. You know, I think regardless of what happens with the outcome of this election, if Donald Trump isn't sort of obviously the victor, he is going to complain, right? He is going to say that this election was fraudulent. If he loses by a few votes, if he loses by a lot of votes, he's going to point to these, he's going to point to the things that he's causing, and he's going to say this election was messy, this election was fraudulent, I don't want to leave. This issue of the time gap, unfortunately, I think could cause some of that messiness, right? So if it is 3 or 4 days after the election before the votes are properly counted, because some of them are in transit, that will delay to some extent the moment when we have certainty about who's won certain key states. That could lead to a very messy post-election situation.
Hey, Evelyn, I see that you're there. Would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, I have a follow-up question to what is just, or not a question, a comment. I think voters abroad have to be informed that they can request their ballot by electronic transmission. A lot of people don't seem to know that. And also, which I've seen on the Democrats Abroad memes sometimes now that's new, to tell them by when they should have their electronic transmission ballot so that they can get in touch with Democrats Abroad or with the county back in the United States or whatever. And I just wanted to know also what individual people can do. You know, I'm saying, of course, contact Democrats Abroad's help desk, but should I contact the liaison at home, or should I write my senators? I mean, I vote from Georgia, so is it worth writing senators in Georgia? I think they're both corrupt, but you know, I'd make the effort if it's worth the shot. But so what can individual people also do?
So, I mean, I'd love to hear from Kim or Alexandra, Elaine, ways that we can work with Democrats abroad on those issues. I will say, with respect to Georgia in particular, Georgia's a very interesting and important place right now. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that there are 3 extremely important elections going on in Georgia. There are 2 U.S. Senate seats, and the outcome of those Senate seats could well determine whether Mitch McConnell continues to be majority leader. And so I think both of the Senate races are extraordinarily important. And then I do think that it is a meaningful battleground state at this point in terms of the presidential election. So Georgia's elections themselves are going to be very important, and Georgia's elections are notoriously plagued with voter suppression that unfortunately comes from the government. So, their Secretary of State's office very clearly bungled Tuesday's election. The former Secretary of State, now governor, I think used what can only be described as illegal means to win the 2018 election. I don't think writing to the U.S. senators from Georgia is going to be particularly effective in changing those rules. But I do think that if you're inclined to get involved in those elections, either by supporting those candidates or somehow sort of helping with the effort in Georgia, that's certainly a place where this election is going to hinge.
Okay. Doesn't answer.
Sorry about that.
I'm sorry.
Is she there? Evelyn, are you there? Sorry about that.
I think she may be asking for more concrete information about how Democrats abroad and how she can work with than I was able to give her. So maybe that's a question for Kim or Alexander or Elaine.
Sure. We're happy to address that afterwards. And by the way, we'll be sharing the entire deck. We're going to move on to another question, and that is to Stephanie. Let's see, Stephanie, go ahead. I pressed unmute.
Hi, are you talking about Stephanie Stewart?
I'm not sure. Alexander?
Because I didn't put my hand up.
Oh, oops. Sorry about that. Perhaps Stephanie Perry?
I'm sorry, I have no question.
Oh, okay.
I think she did helpfully put the link to Suppress the movie, which I think is definitely worth watching if anybody has a few minutes. It's not a long video.
Okay. Thank you. All right, well then I guess the next question is from me. So Quentin, I was wondering, what's the chance that President Trump is going to try and delay the actual elections?
So as I think about nightmare scenarios, the nightmare scenario that I'm most worried about in that respect is unwillingness to concede the election as opposed to pushing the election. He doesn't feel constrained by laws. So the answer is he cannot push this election. He just is not allowed to. I think that any legitimate court would look at the rules around elections and say that if he tried to do so, Nancy Pelosi would become the president, right? That when the term ends, the order of succession would move from the president and vice president to the Speaker of the House, and that if he were to fail to hold an election, he doesn't have the power to do that, but let's imagine that he could. Even if he could, he would no longer be the president as of the inauguration day in January if he were to try to do that. So I'm a little bit less worried about that as a concern than I am about the notion that he will not accept the results. And that he will create a dual narrative about what's going on. So imagine a world in which CNN and the New York Times, which he considers fake news, announce that their belief is that Joe Biden has received enough electoral votes to become president. He says it was fraud. Vote by mail is fraudulent. We all know vote by mail is fraudulent. We all know that CNN and New York Times are in the are vehicles of the Democratic Party or whatever. And then you have sort of this weird situation where either through the courts or courts of public opinion, you have an election that's sort of in doubt. If you think about what happened with Bush v. Gore, I think I started sort of this conversation with Bush v. Gore. Part of what happened with Bush v. Gore, of course, was that the US Supreme Court looked at what the Florida Supreme Court had done and made a determination, which I think was probably wrong, but in any event, they decided the election. But the other thing that happened was that Al Gore conceded, right? Al Gore said, look, you know, even though I won the popular vote, if you lose the Electoral College, you concede. And even though I disagree, you know, the Supreme Court ruled and whatever. I just can't imagine Trump being classy in those ways, right? And so the thing that makes me nervous is what happens if we have, you know, I mean, we've had a constitutional crisis, I think, for sort of about 3 years, but you know, we would have a real constitutional crisis if Trump didn't concede. And you know, imagine that this is a narrow victory for Joe Biden. I think that he will point to any examples of the election not being run perfectly as a justification. And I imagine that there are going to be lots of examples of ways in which this election is not going to go perfectly because primaries haven't gone perfectly. He's making it harder for us to run an election that's fair. And so it's going to be easy to point to ways in which this election was flawed because it's going to be flawed. So I worry that we may be headed for a crisis in the legitimacy of the election more than I worry about the timing of the election. The other thing that I worry about, of course, I worry about a lot of things, but another thing that I worry about is voter disinformation online. So we saw in the 2016 election, we saw certainly in some of the Brexit vote, some other elections that we've had recently, efforts to obtain micro-targeting information about certain kinds of voters and foreign interference that is focused on creating confusion about people's rights or about certain candidates. And I expect, particularly in a world in which people are online a lot more, I expect that kind of disinformation campaign to be much more robust this year. And to be much more micro-targeted and to take place across a lot of different pieces of the internet than it has historically. So I think we will see lies targeted at groups of voters ramp up over the next few months. And it will be a challenge for everyone to try and figure out how to combat that misinformation. Looking at your own context, I would be worried about misinformation about what are the rights of voters voting from abroad who are eligible to vote, sort of being spread and thinking about how we can make sure that people have accurate information about their rights. I do worry about cybersecurity risk. It's a different kind of a problem. The best solution to the cybersecurity risk, and we know that foreign governments are actively engaged in efforts to undermine the legitimacy of our elections. The best response to that is paper ballots, whether they're by mail or as part of an in-person voting system. But we are going to have to be wary about the sort of next phase of the kind of cybersecurity attacks that we know happened in the 2016 election. We've seen happen in other elections since then.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to ask everyone, is it okay? Because I know that our event we actually said was from 7:30 until 8:30, which is right now. We do have 2 other people in the queue. Would it be okay for us to extend? Is that okay with you, Quentin, if we have 2 more questions?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Okay. All right. So I'd like to call on Maya next.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, hi Maya, nice to meet you.
Hi, thanks. Great talk, I'm glad you could join us. I have, well, 2 quick questions actually. One is voters from abroad are having a potentially facing a huge obstacle in the sense that so many states don't allow you to return your ballot via email attachment or web portal. We have 26 states that do. And the rest of them are going to be in a real bind trying to make sure they can return their ballots. There are many countries where international post is not in operation now because of COVID. And I wondered, do you have any tips for how we're advocating for email and web portal ballot return options for all 50 states? Do you have any tips for that? And my other question was, I know there's for voters who are voting within the states, I know there's a massive push for vote by mail, but there's still a lot of people who cannot or will not be using vote by mail, even if it's offered, because for all sorts of reasons, that maybe they're in temporary housing, maybe they've been purged, all sorts of legitimate reasons. Is there any way for us from afar to help support and protect those voters, to encourage them to feel safe to still go out and vote? Like, are there organizations that we can support, or anything that we can do from afar? Those are my two questions.
So those are great questions, and I actually think I'm going to give you the same answer to both, or a variant of the same answer to both. I just actually posted an op-ed that I have in the Boston Globe from last week, which I take on with a colleague, Mike Firestone, which I take on the second question. But I think one of our friends asked the question, should we be contacting the US senators from Georgia? And the answer is, I don't think that the Senate, Washington is broken, right? Washington is broken, Congress is broken. There may be some ways in which they do some stuff, but for relating to the election, but I think for the most part, the notion that we're going to end up with a meaningful step forward that comes out of Washington is small. There's a bill that Klobuchar and Wyden have that is worth pushing for, but I don't think it's going to happen. State legislatures, on the other hand, are almost all of them are grappling with some of these issues, and they're running out of time. But there are opportunities, I think, at the local level to try to influence some of the details of how some of these things are handled. So I can't go into every 50 state, partially because I don't know, and partially because we don't have time. But I would consider the question whether there's a piece of legislation that's being considered in your state capital that might get to the question of how they might process absentee ballot from abroad or more generally, and see if you can weigh in on those questions, because there are still opportunities to influence the way that states are thinking about their rules. And some of that is legislative, which generally I think of legislation as not feasible 4 months before an election, but I think in most states it's still feasible. But the other thing is that secretaries of state and county election officials have some administrative powers that allow them to interpret rules in certain ways that they can do much more nimbly than passing legislation. So I think it is worth thinking about how you might influence the state where you are voting, where you're a resident. I think that's kind of your most actionable step there. In terms of in-person voting, you're absolutely right. So one of the things that we have learned is that vote by mail, which has been very successful in a number of states. I was recently talking to the Colorado Secretary of State about some of the ways that they administer it. It's a very good system. It's worked very well, particularly in the western part of the United States. What we've seen is that African Americans in particular are the least likely to utilize vote by mail. That is also true of anything you change quickly. So when in my home state of Massachusetts, we recently dramatically expanded early voting for certain elections. And that initially was most successful in the most affluent communities and was the slowest to be adopted in some of the communities of color and some of the least affluent communities. So I think that your question gets to a really important point, which is the most vulnerable voters are the ones that are most likely to vote in person. And I think that is why encouraging states and counties to devote enough resources to in-person voting, whether that's polling places or poll workers or machines or parking. You know, it's funny, everybody thinks about kind of voter protection. They think about, you know, these arguments in the Supreme Court around Bush v. Gore and the, you know, ballots and the dents and, you know, fancy legal arguments. And actually, at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to, like, are there enough human beings to process the darn paper, right? Are there enough parking spots where you want to go to vote, right? And so thinking in really concrete terms about how we pressure local officials and supporting groups like the Voter Protection Corps, who are doing that work in some really important places and in some data-driven ways, I think actually is one of the sort of highest leverage ways that we can prevent what happened on Tuesday in Atlanta from being what happens nationwide in November.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, next I would like to call on Miguel. Go ahead.
Good morning. Hello.
Hi, Miguel. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's almost 7 a.m. here, so I had to wake up early. So I have a question. For 2018, a woman from Philadelphia came up to me and said, "Hey, I've been trying to register to vote using the FPCA form, and I've been rejected twice because my signature doesn't match." So she asked me, "What can you do, or what can I do to make sure my vote is counted and make sure the FPCA is accepted?" She even asked me if she should sue the county of Philadelphia to see if they do something about it. So I felt very powerless. I didn't know what to answer. I voted in Ohio. I've never had trouble registering to vote. I've never had trouble with the FPCA or giving my ballot back to my PLEO. So I just wanted to know, what would you do if your FPCA form is rejected constantly? So I still have no idea how to answer this question, and I guess that the best way to go through is asking you, an election expert. So what would you do?
Thanks, Miguel. I have an answer, but it's a bad answer. I have a friend who litigates a lot of these cases, and he brought forth an expert witness in one of the pieces of litigation who was an FBI forensic investigator who specializes in signatures. And what they tell you, if you ask them, is a good forensic expert who spends their career on this needs 50 examples of a signature in order to feel confident that they are actually by the same person. Unfortunately, a lot of our systems sort of put on individual non-expert administrators the burden of determining whether a signature is true or not, based on with no training and with 2 examples. And you know, this is a problem if, you know, just sort of in the ordinary course, you sign your signature in different ways, but it's also a problem if, say, you have Parkinson's, right? And your signature is different on different days, or there in some states, there's the ability to sign for somebody else if you're taking care of them. So it's a terrible, terrible system, and it is a system that disenfranchises people, and where the best short-term answer, unfortunately, is just persistence and advocacy. The best long-term answer is fixing some of this structure so that identity verification is fairer, and so that it doesn't lock out people who are eligible voters. But you know, there's also this sort of countervailing thing where because President Trump and others have sort of tried to delegitimize voting by mail, there also is a fair amount of reluctance to say, and we're also going to make signature verification easier, because there's a worry that is going to give a talking point to people trying to delegitimize voting by mail.
Okay,
so
great.
it's not a good answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And then for our last questions, Madeline, go ahead. Let me unmute you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Quentin, and also to some of you who have put up some stuff in the chat that's extraordinarily useful. I'm on the core team for communications, which is getting cobbled together very, very quickly for DA. And also I'm working with, in Spain, where I live, we want to get out the vote on a military basis. I have a very long memory and started tracking this issue as of 2000. And 2004 was an absolute debacle. My mom lived in Florida. She told me her story, and it absolutely tracked with what I had been reading. So I don't know if you know black box voting and Beverly somebody and all that. And then kind of it went on from there in terms of the hackability of the machines and the proprietary nature of them and all that. I had, my questions have racked up, and then some of them have been answered as I'm listening to you. And I've got a huge knot in my stomach with anxiety about this because I have been following it and I'm working with DA pretending that nothing will happen. But particularly with the military, I remember as of 2000 and then 2004 and subsequent elections, the military ballots were being thrown out in Florida. And so as kind of an advocate for, and we're going to be visiting the bases, and I'm also liaising with the caucus, the Military and Vets Caucus here, DA's Military and Vets Caucus, what, if any, particular measures can be done? It may have to do with how they vote, but my understanding is they can put ballots into a, forgot the word, a satchel that gets sent directly to their states. What can be done to help protect those, if anything in particular? And also I want to tell you that I have just contributed to your organization. He's muted.
I'm so sorry. So first of all, thank you so much, Madeline, both for supporting voter protection Corps, but also for your work supporting members of the military voting from abroad. The notion that people serving in uniform, serving our country abroad, would face obstacles to voting is just shameful, and we should work to overcome that. I mean, I think there's sort of 2 points of intervention with that. One is, of course, the bases themselves are a locus for solutions to some of these problems and the chain of command within the military. But a lot of that does end up being processed on the other end by individual state governments. And so I think a lot of times the military face some of the same challenges that other Democrats abroad or other voters abroad are going to face. I'm afraid I'm not expert in some of the challenges that are faced kind of in the transit process from the military. I'm afraid you probably know these challenges better than I do. I think on the back end, they do end up sort of in the same set of messy circumstances that other absentee voters end up in, and that is often quite troubling. But as to the military base issues, I'm afraid you're probably more expert than I am.
I'll just say that they're having trouble. There are VOAs, which is voting something representatives that are supposed to be on every single base, and they're having trouble even contacting them. They get no reply, they get nothing. When it's done under neutral guise by vets who are trying to contact them. And that by itself, to me, smacks of obstruction. If that's what that person's supposed to be doing, well, I may have to have a stiff drink after this talk.
Yeah.
If I may actually talk a little bit about that. So, I mean, everyone knows that it's a really tough year right now. So, for example, I know for a fact that American Citizen Services is probably not fully staffed because the borders are closed right now. And so what I would suggest to you and what we're doing in our country chapter is that we're basically coming up with you know, all the alternative methods. So if we can't actually use a diplomatic pouch, how much is it going to cost, right? Like, and try and figure out the logistics as a backup now so that we have it for later. And okay, well, thank you so much, Quentin. If you could give a round of applause. We learned so much. And if I could actually, I'm gonna unmute everybody. And if we could, oh God.
Yeah, if everyone can try to get on the screen so I can take a little screenshot, that would be great. Hope you had some time to put on your makeup during this last hour of the call. those that want to, you know. Just give.
Maybe we can't see you.
Alex, I can't see you. Maybe that's just like a problem with my screen. All right. So I don't know, just smile, and my screenshot takes a little bit of time, so just keep that smile on and hopefully it'll get us at a good moment. All right, great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. It's a real pleasure to meet you. I really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Quentin. I mean, we're going to be putting out a write-up for sure after all of this, and just wanted everyone to see that this is how you could get in touch with Quentin's nonprofit called info@voterprotection.org, and I believe that he also did just drop his own email address in there. Thank you so much for that. Let's see, am I scrolling forward? Yes, I am.
Yes.
Yep. And wait, before you go, I just wanted to let everyone know that we do have an actual next speaker coming up on June 28th that is also going to be talking about elections and voting. Alexander, would you like to jump in right now and talk a little bit more? Hello? Okay, maybe not. Let's see, I see that he's muted. Okay, well,
might be having.
Can't hear you, Kim.
Oh, can you hear me? Hello? Sorry. Can people?
I think you might be having some connection problems. So basically, I'll just speak for Alexander for a quick moment. Hopefully, maybe he'll be able to give a better explanation later. But basically, Greg Palast is an investigative journalist. He has, since the 2000 elections, published a book every election about how various corporate interests are trying to steal elections. And, you know, they find new and nefarious ways every 4 years. He actually has a video that he's done during 2016, a documentary he created that he's actually giving out for free to all Democrats Abroad members. And so we will post that link in here, but I think we'll also inform you guys of it later as well. And it's definitely worth a watch. He's quite a character. So it's a very entertaining way to learn about some of the things that are happening to our vote that are perhaps not otherwise fun to smile about.
Great, thank you. And also some upcoming events for us. On June 16th, we're gonna be having a phone banking training. The 21st is our own leadership board meeting. 28th, our next speaker series that we just talked about. And July 4th is potential on-the-ground voter registration events in Shanghai and Beijing, COVID permitting. And another reminder is September 10th is the last call for you to request your ballot to vote from abroad. And just to make sure, I'm pretty sure almost everyone on this call is already a member, but in case you aren't, please join us. And for the phone banking training, anyone in China, feel free to scan in for this. We're going to teach everyone how to use Call Hub. We also have voter registration training. I am going to drop in the link for our wiki page because we just had an amazing voter registration training this past weekend, and we did a recording of it. And our stuff is, if I may say, and fluff my own feathers or our own feathers, very, very good and very robust. And we have pretty much every single question that everyone may ask, unless it's something a little bit challenging that Miguel had mentioned. Okay, just putting that in there. All right. And just another reminder about your upcoming elections. Okay, so just take a look, because of course, like, it's not just about top of ballot. We have a lot of down ballot elections that are just as important. And if you can, please give us a follow on social media. Elaine does an amazing job with the team on this. And lastly, if you can, please donate to us. And that's it. Thank you, everyone. All right. Thank you. Quentin, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I'm going to stop the recording right now.